welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, aka the guy who gets away with Mordor, and this video we're breaking down Rings of Power Episode 3. After everyone loved our last breakdown, I loved it. I thought we'd dive back into the show for everyone who's still watching to bring you everything you need to know about the characters, callbacks, and our thoughts on the entry. However, if a character pops up in the main Lord of the Rings film series, then I think that they're fair game to talk about, so check out now if you don't want those connections confirmed. This is mainly referring to Elendil and Isildur, who we already see what happens to in the Fellowship of the Rings. Super long disclaimer, but yeah, you've just got to preface the video with that before we dive into it. With that out of the way, thanks for clicking the video, now let's get into the Rings of Power. Now this episode is called Adar, which is the name of a corrupted Elvish warlord who has been described as being one of the main antagonists of this series. He pops up at the end of the entry, and he's played by another Game of Thrones alumni in Joseph Mawle. So far we've got Young Ned Stark, Uncle Ben, not that one, and Old Ned Stark all being tied to Lord of the Rings stuff. My brain is f***ing f***ed from the lore of these two series, and at this point, I feel like they've replaced the memories of my family, even my beloved Uncle Daemon. Was it Daemon? I think his name was Daemon. What? Now both episode 1 and 2 were kind of absent of villains other than the ones that we saw briefly like Sauron. Adar is a completely new character for the show, and a corrupted elf is an interesting way to take things that we haven't really seen before. This entry opens with an orc saying for Adar, and this is brought full circle by his introduction at the end. Elves are usually on the side of good, but there are some that ended up committing bad acts, which has been seen in a number of characters. Fëanor ended up attacking elves in an event known as the Kinslaying, which may have been teased at in episode 1. Now that took place in the Silmarillion, and as many of you pointed out in our last video, Amazon doesn't actually own the rights to that. Huge apologies for saying that they did, and I kinda got a bit lost in the rights issue stuff as it's all a lot of legal babble that I still don't fully get. Now last episode saw Elrond invoking the right of Sigyn Tarag in Khazad-dûm. The stranger pointed out a constellation to Nori that he made with fireflies, and Bronwyn's village packed up and left due to orcs starting to show up in the area. Huge shoutouts to Eric Voss for pointing out that the map regions that we see in the Southlands actually also have a mountain range that resembles what would later become Mordor. When we later see a map of the area, we can catch the same landmarks there, which lines up with the evil lands. This means that we could end up seeing the formation of the region throughout this series. Amazon has said that they plan to do 5 seasons, with the creative team saying that they already know what the final shot will be in the final episode. Now we begin with Arondir being dragged through Adar's stronghold. This opening is a bit trippy with the camera being blurred to convey his state of being knocked out. I kinda hate when shows and movies do stuff like this, and to be honest, I kinda found the Arondir stuff a bit weak in this entry. I get the creative choice behind this, as we do end the entry with this blur returning in order to tease the villain, but yeah, it's just a bit of a weird way to open the episode. Now when is Adar not Adar? When it's a jar, and that's why we get 8,000 dislikes. Thanks a lot, you chumps. Now there are a couple of important details here, such as the cloths that hang over the orc's hideout, and these help to block out the sun. Last week we saw that the orc who attacked Bronwyn had lots of burn marks all over its body, and here we watch as the sun scalds their skin almost like they're vampires. This is why Saruman bred the Uruk-hai, because they were able to move during the daylight, making them far more formidable. They've also kept things in line with the way that Peter Jackson presented them, with the orcs carrying Cockney accents. Now this one reminded me a lot of the one from the Two Towers, and I feel like both the design and voiceovers were meant to be similar to echo that. Cut across to Galadriel, who hears the screams of the elves, and as we saw in the Fellowship, she did possess somewhat psychic powers. Galadriel was able to communicate telepathically with the Fellowship, and she could also sense when Frodo was coming due to him bringing great evil through the ring. Everyone calls her a Mary Sue, and I've no idea who that is, but maybe people are just jealous of Mary Sue because it sounds like she's great at everything. Hey, having that? Anyway, she shacked it with Halbrand, who we learn a lot more about in this entry. I want to talk about him more in detail when we get to that part of the episode, but it is starting to seem likely that he might be Theo's father. We discover that he comes from the Southlands and that he was driven away from his home. This is also something that Theo brought up when discussing his father, and Halbrand likely ushers in the new king. However, as we know from the lore, several of the king's men were corrupted by Sauron and they were turned into ringwraiths. I'm still holding strong on the theory that Halbrand will end up becoming the Witch King, and that his character arc throughout the 5 seasons will follow him as he rises up and gets corrupted. Travelling out on the boat, we also meet Elendil, and later his son Isildur. You'll likely know these names from the book and movie trilogy, with them being extremely important in the first battle against Sauron. Elendil ended up becoming the King of Arnor and Gondor, and he also gained the title of High King of Dundian. Is it Dundian or Dundane? Anyway, moving on. Known as a great warrior, he fought alongside Gil-galad in the first battle that opens up the Fellowship. In that scene we saw as he was struck down by Sauron, and his son Isildur then rushed to his side. He ended up seemingly defeating the villain, but due to him being unwilling to toss the ring into Mount Doom, the evil was allowed to live on. The reasons for this will likely be explored in the series, with Numenor taking a big focus as to why he wants to hold onto all the power that he ends up having. Isildur was later killed when he was attacked by Orcs, and he ended up losing the ring, which we learn betrayed him. I feel like the entire show will likely build up towards the battle at the start of Fellowship, with all these key characters falling into place throughout the entire series. The show is having to condense a lot of characters and timelines together due to the elves living such long lifetimes, and if they actually did the series in the time frame the books take place in, then we'd have to change the human characters out every week, because they'd be dead, like my enthusiasm is right now. Now, we also meet his daughter and Isildur's sister. She never featured in the original work, and instead the focus was put on his brother, who I don't know if they're actually going to be appearing in the series. In the original work, this was a character known as an Aryan, however, the series has changed things up and created a completely new one in order to replace her. Gonna go down well, and when discussing this with Lupa, Emma Horvath said, "Her name is Aryan, she's the baby of the family. I think she was created because the schism that happens on the island also needs to be reflected within the family. She serves a plot function in that sense, and she also replaces the feminine hole that's been left by the loss of their mother. At least she's trying her hardest this season to be as much of a mother as she can to her very troubled brother." So yeah, lots of things going on with her, and Numenor is also a very important location that we visit in the episode. We watch as the beacons light up as the ship travels in, and there's also lots of cool details that we see on this journey. Now this is an island kingdom, and we see what it looks like later on when we travel from the location to the Southlands on the map. As you can see, it sits in the Sundering Sea, surrounded by a vast ocean. The city we visit is actually Armenilos, which is the capital of the realm, and it's where major parts of the season will be taking place. Described as being the greatest kingdom of men, we watch as there are giant heads serving as tributes to the kings that have come before. You also see a massive one pouring water down, and huge shoutouts to Nerd of the Rings for pointing out that this may be Vala Ulna, aka the Lord of Waters. Though we don't get this fully confirmed, the statues we've seen of him in art based on the books does bear some resemblance to him, so I'm guessing that it's him. Nerd of the Rings, definitely go check them out. Now as they enter the archway, we can catch a sun symbol at the top. This is an emblem that appears on a lot of things throughout the kingdom, and it's important to pay attention to it. Now as they pull into the port, we can catch the holy mountain of Numenor in the background, which is known as Mount Meneltarma. This was devoted to the god Ilúvatar, who we talked about in our first breakdown. He basically created the universe in order and everything within it. Birds didn't approach this mountain except for eagles, and these were seen as the holy guardians of the shrine. Next to him we can catch a statue of Elendil, who was actually Elrond's father. He was also the father of Elros, aka Elrond's brother, and he's a very important character in the lore. He was a half-elven mariner who travelled to Valinor, and he carried a star across the sky during the First Age. Elendil of course sounds very similar to his name, and it means the one who loves stars, potentially tying back to this. It also means elfriend, and we know that Elendil does fight side by side with them during the Great Battle. I think the statue is purposely done like this to invoke images of the Argonath who we saw in the Fellowship of the Rings. Interestingly, his hand is open and almost welcoming. However, the Argonath were holding up an open palm, almost as if they were saying, "Stop, don't come any closer, you bastard." Now this shows how the mindset of men changed, with them being welcoming initially, but after all the stuff that goes down at Numenor, things end up changing. The entire kingdom is clearly a precursor to Minas Tirith, with the main part being very similar in design to how that great city is laid out. You of course have the triangular walkway, and this possesses a white tree in the middle similar to how it's laid out there. Known as Nimloth the Fair, this grew in the king's court, and it descended from the great trees that we saw in the intro last week. Isildur ended up taking a seedling from it, and this was replanted in Middle-earth. Its descendants were going to be called the White Trees of Gondor, and it ties these kingdoms all together. Now as we hear, when their petals fall, it's seen as a bad omen, ushering in a great event. A leaf falling of course happened with the arrival of the stranger, and it's sort of like poetry, they rhyme. Now, one thing we missed last week was that Eregion's ruins could actually be seen in the Fellowship, again tying these kingdoms and their lineage to the main series. As they walk through the streets, we learn some of the history, including how the men of Numenor stood with the elves, whereas the Southland ones sided with Morgoth. We see the difference in the locations, with this being a vast expansive kingdom, whereas the Southlands are a shithole, just like Sunderland. Hey, got them again. I'm just kidding. Probably moving there soon, which, it's me bloody wife. Anyway, the elves gifted the Numenorians his kingdom, but it didn't make the tensions any easier. Similar to the dwarves, the people are still untrusting of the elves, and as mentioned in episode 2, the fact that elves were immortal caused a number of issues. They weren't really able to build relationships because they missed out on a lot of big events, such as birthdays and also funerals. Don't want to spoil what happens to this pair, but they are very important, and they have their own rivalry and quest for power. If you pay close attention to her, you'll also notice a symbol in the middle of her chest, and this appears in the titles made out of the lines of sand. Really nice touch having Galadriel listing off her titles, and this rubs everyone the wrong way. Even though Halbrand could do this due to what we later learn, he prefers to play certain situations to his advantage by appearing humble so that people drop their guards. This is a tactic he uses on Elendil in order to gain the two-tree dagger, and also later at the bar. These are people who don't take kindly to him in these parts, but he gets them to drop their guard by pretending to be a grateful friend. He plays the situation well, whereas she comes in demanding rides and security, and they're clearly making her character like this so she can learn how to deal with people whilst avoiding confrontation. They're made to wait 3 days, which Galadriel thinks could spell Mount Doom for the Southlands, and she wants to get out. Now, Halbrand does a line about not wanting to leap back into the furnace, and it might be a reach, it might be, but I thought this was playing on the term out of the frying pan into the fire. This was the name of the 6th chapter in the Hobbit book, so I feel like the lines were purposely put across like this. After meeting Isildur and his sister, I was thinking my man might end up doing a Jaime Lannister, cause goddamn, wait, cut that. Elendil is also forced by Miriel to perform a service for the realm, and he's sent to very much spying Galadriel. Now he ends up striking up a friendship with her after showing he speaks Elvish, again tying back to his nickname of Elfriend. He points out that the statues throughout the city have Elvish inscriptions on them, and these are somewhat reminiscent of the tree carvings that appeared in episode 1. The pair ride out to the Hall of Lore on horseback, and you know what? It was really nice seeing Galadriel enjoying herself. Come on, you can't hate that bit, surely. It was a really beautiful beach scene, and it reminded me of a Scottish Widow advert, but yeah, it was nice exploring the island. I wasn't crying there, by the way, I promise. Now back with Arondir, we see as he's reunited with the other 2 elves from his patrol, and we watch as they search for what we're told is some sort of weapon. Whilst we don't know what this is, it likely calls back to the blade that Theo took with him last week. We discussed in our last video how it reformed almost like a Morgul blade, being dusted in reverse. This was seen when Aragorn grabbed it after Frodo got stabbed, and here we watched as blood from Theo reformed it. Galadriel's company brought up the Unseen World in episode 1, and they discussed how those at the mountain lair had been experimenting with it. Those stabbed by Morgul blades were pulled into the Unseen World, which is where Frodo started to go after being struck by it. So I think that the weapon is the sword, and it could be pulling them in, or pulling Sauron out, or maybe even Morgoth. Who knows? Now initially, they believe that Adar is an alias of Sauron, and it could well be. In the books, he appeared in many forms, and he took the name Anitar, which translated to Lord of Gifts. He ended up befriending Celebrimbor, and basically led them on a path so that they could create the rings. This could tie into the Furnace plot with Celebrimbor, and due to there being several forms of the character, Adar could be one too. I don't really think that that's the case, but I thought I'd just touch upon it for a bit due to the conversation that Arondir has. Now they also talk about running for the tree line when the sunlight hits, but we see how this fails come the end of the entry. You also have an awkward exchange, awkward with their captors, and they're given water which makes them lower their guards so one can be killed. Lots of slow-mo during this, and I feel like elves are always killed like this due to them being endless. Peter Jackson did it a lot too, but due to not really caring about this character, I didn't find it that impactful. Now this death is all started by them refusing to shift a tree out the way, and elves were known as big preservers. Because they live forever, well except for this guy, they wanted to keep things the same with very little change. This is why they went to the west, where they could be away from every other race. Men were banned from there because they lived short lives and changed much, whereas elves just wanted to keep the status quo. Now Arondir eventually agrees to cut the tree down, and using a great axe he starts to take it out. At the top he gets a look at the no man's land that they've created, and this resembles what Saruman did with the forest and two towers. He faced the wrath of the Ents, and we know from the end of episode 1 that they're out in the world. This could possibly come into play down the line, but let me know below exactly how you think he's going to get out of this. Now Halbrand ends up trying to become a blacksmith, but he's rejected. The boss has a golden sigil on his top, which we learn is a gold crest, and Halbrand manipulates the punters in the bar in order to steal theirs. This will allow him to forge steel and gain a weapon. Now there's a nice little detail you might miss, but when he's in the bar with them standing up, if you watch Halbrand's hand, then you can see his arm reaching around the guy's shoulder. He then unclips the crest and walks off with it as he goes. They did something similar with a boat scene last week, and you could actually see him slowly pushing away from the raft as the worm came in. Really nice little scene that had me chuckling, and this then goes into the typical back alley brawl that shows a character knows how to handle themselves. I feel like they could have skipped this, but they're clearly showing that Halbrand is a skilled fighter. It's a bit cliche, the whole back alley thing, but it sets up that he's going to be really deadly if he gets a weapon. He's caught by the gods, and they're all wearing golden armor, like what we first saw at the start of Fellowship of the Rings. Back with Galadriel, we watch as she draws Sauron's symbol, and discovers that this is actually a map rather than it being a sigil. It once more confirms that the enemy is in the Southlands, and that their plan is to create a realm where evil will thrive. This was to be enacted in the event of Morgoth's defeat, and in the ashes, Mordor will rise. Now other interesting details that happen here is that Elros himself assembled the Hall of Law. We also learn that because the king was loyal to the elves that he was cast out. I think he'll likely be a character that pops up in the series. I thought all this stuff was really gripping, and pulling out to see the map revelation was a twist I don't think anyone picked up on. Had me like,
I had you looking in the wrong section. How could I be so stupid?
Oop, wrong franchise. Now back with the Harfoots, we see them doing another slow motion thing, and it's basically a forest ritual where they remember the fallen. They hammer home the idea that they are safer together, and as they don't have an established home like the Shire yet, they're constantly on the move. Due to their size, they're pretty weak, and thus they have to scavenge in order to survive. The weak are left behind, and though Nori's family would struggle with this, the stranger ends up helping out. Okay, so the stranger is called the stranger because Amazon want to keep his true name a close guarded secret. They've created lots of original characters for the series, and therefore I think that he ties into the greater lore. Now he could be Gandalf or Saruman, but I think it would cause too many issues with the fanbase. They have enough as it is, and wizards typically came from the ocean, with Saruman being the one who arrives first, and we haven't heard about him. Now there are lots of ties to the stranger and fire. In episode 1 we watched as the company of elves said that their torches didn't give off any heat because of how evil it was. The lack of heat was also shown with Nori, who said that the stranger's meteorite fire on the ground didn't give off any heat either. In Fellowship, Gandalf of course tossed the ring into the fire at Bilbo so that the inscription could be read, and he also remarked on the item being quite cool. Therefore, this could be Anatar, who we talked about before, and he could be coming in under the guise of being a friend. Probably Gandalf though, isn't it? And that's the end of people are going to go wild, but that's the end of theory time. Theory time. Might not be true, it's just a theory. Don't get angry, because it's a theory, I'm telling you. An idiot. Anyway, Logo says that if they're at the front of the caravan, then they'll be okay, but they're banished to the back where they'll be easier for the wolves to pick off. Also, we said last week that the creatures around them were wargs, but we actually meet one in this episode. Whereas those wolves look like entaldonts, the wargs are way closer to a dog, and they would later be bred to become even bigger and more fearsome. Nori too digs out maps for the constellation, and I think it's all going to end with the characters converging in the Southlands. These are accidentally burned by the stranger, so they're going to have to find another way. That night they pay respect to the dead, and there's lots of similarities to Bilbo's speech in the Fellowship of the Ring. These are the names of all those who fell behind in prior migrations, and this death of course causes worry for the Brandyfoots. Amongst these we hear several proud fellows who died along the way, and these are all family members of Poppy explaining why she's alone. You also hear phrases like the tallest milkweed gets snipped, which is the Middle-earth version of the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Now Isildur sees his phrase in action too after he tries to defer his duty to the sea trial, but his sister gets accepted into the Builders Guild. Galadriel visits Halbrand in jail and she brings his sigil with him, which confirms he was the king of the Southlands. She noticed this last week on the raft, and we can see why he's ashamed due to his ancestors swearing an oath to Morgoth. He's very much fitting the Aragorn role of being the reluctant king, but he's gonna have to do it because all the other kings are gone. F***ing hells. Sorry about that. You know what? The dislike's right there. I'm not even mad. What do you mean you already hit it? Now, Galadriel believes that it's fate that the pair have been brought together and that this union can finally unite the elves and men against the greater evil. Obviously, we know this happens with Elendil and Isildur, but due to Halbrand being missing, I do think there will be more to him. Now, we also see a puppet show with a blonde-haired elf that fights off an evil villain in order to save the queen. I don't know if this is pulling from the extended lore, as I can't think of a time with this, but it might be referring to something in the past. I was thinking maybe Luthien, who sang at Morgoth, but there wasn't a queen involved and she had darker hair. She did appear in the tree carvings last week. I think the puppet show is more just a prophecy with Galadriel. It likely spells the big event that's coming with Numenor. The stranger ends up helping the caravan, and the entry ends with Arondir's plan failing, and we get the arrival of Adar. Now, as for my thoughts on the episode, I was a bit disappointed with how this turned out. Felt that in comparison to last week that this was a step down that unfortunately focused a bit too much on world building again rather than getting the plot moving. We still don't really have any idea where this series is going outside of it building towards the big battle with Sauron, and outside of Numenor and the Halbrand revelation, I don't think this really had anything that I'm going to remember all that much this time next week. Now, because I said that I enjoyed the first 15 minutes of episode 1 and the last 15 minutes of it, and also said that 2 was more consistent but with less high moments, I'm apparently a paid shill by Amazon. Fucking wish I was, mate, because I'd much rather be chilling with Bezos on an island somewhere with my daughter Rhaenyra rather than doing this, talking to you, you piece of shit. I love you really, but honestly though, I'm just not tied up into the whole culture war thing because I just don't care. Like, if you want to hear people shitting on the show every week, then that's fine. There's lots of great channels out there right now dropping videos made just for you. I honestly try and approach this stuff with an open mind and offer positives and negatives in my reviews because that's just what I try to do. Now, I did have comments saying I shill for this and She-Hulk to get early access, but if you've seen my reviews on that show, then you'll know I haven't exactly been singing its praises. Now, I know there will be some of you out there that think I get paid for reviews, but unless I show you my bank account, there's absolutely no way to prove that. I think companies would actually be much better off giving money to channels that say everything is bad instead of me. And if there were studios offering people money for reviews, then it 100% would have leaked out by now. That's basically because there would be someone who refused to take the money, and they definitely would have went to social media and told everyone about the whole situation. So yeah, long story short, Amazon didn't pay me this week, so the show was f***ing sorry, just had to get that out of the way. Bit of a rant. But I do think the world building and pacing of this one really let it down. And whereas we had lots of scope and scale in the first 2 episodes, outside of Numenor, this was pretty much just characters going through dialogue and talking about the world rather than having actual moments. I felt Elrond and the dwarves were a big miss, and both Arondir and the Nori stuff didn't really catch my interest. So that's the bad, and now on to the good. So I'm trying to do negatives and positives. Now, as for the good, I think Halbrand and Galadriel's story has been really interesting, especially with us starting to learn more things about the men in Morgoth. Watching him play and manipulate people is a really clever character trait, as it makes you get swept up in his charm without also realising that there's a darker side to it. I think that he's great to watch, and if they do twist him into a villain, he'll become an even stronger part of the series. Now, if you know what happens with Numenor, then you'll know that's going to be a major part of the series, and judging by the visuals and budget, Amazon do have the money to pull it off. Again, the visuals are once more really good, and I do think this is up there as being one of the best looking TV shows of all time in terms of the sets and CGI. You compare it to some other shows' CGI at the moment, and it's night and day in terms of how much better it looks. So overall, there's your positives and your negatives, and I would say again that this episode was a bit of a step down, but I'm hoping that now we know all the characters that we can just hit the ground running next week. I don't think there's anyone left to introduce unless we bring Sauron into the fold properly, so maybe next time I'll be a bit more enamoured with it. And obviously I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. Keep it respectful please, and understand that people will have different opinions to you. I know it sounds crazy, and it doesn't mean that they're bots or shills. They just might like the show. You know, there's people who like sport, but some don't like rugby, and some like football. You see what I'm saying, mate? It's just a matter of taste. You get me? I know you do. You're a smart kid. Anyway, we are in a competition right now and giving away 3 copies of Top Gun Maverick on the 15th of September. All you have to do to be on the chance of winning is like the video, make sure you subscribe with notifications on, and drop a comment below with your thoughts on the episode. We pick the comments at random on the 15th, and the winners of the last one are on screen right now, so if that's you, message me on Twitter at HeavySpoilers. If you want something else to watch, then make sure you check out our breakdown of House of the Dragon, which will be linked on screen right now. We've gone over everything you need to know about the latest entry, and if you haven't watched it, get yourself over there. With that out of the way, thanks for sticking through the video. I've been Paul, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Peace.